Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak with each one to one. I'm delighted to welcome CUNY alumna Dr. Tamara Rose Brown to the program. She's assistant professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and trained at both Queens College and the CUNY Graduate Center. A Brooklyn resident, she has found the material for her research right in her own backyard. As the mother of young children, she spent hours of her days in neighborhood parks and playgroups and found herself in the minority there because she was not a nanny. The result of her research, Raising Brooklyn, Nannies, Childcare, and Caribbeans Creating Community. It's recently been published in paperback by New York University Press. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
So what made you decide to write a book about caregivers, about nannies?
Well, I started having children of my own. I started going to public parks because I've been socialized to think that's what mothers do with their children. And as I encountered people in the parks, I started to listen to their accents, and I started recognizing familiar accents, which were West Indian accents. And I wondered, what were these Caribbean women doing here with these white children, essentially? And I thought this warranted further investigation.
So you're a sociologist, obviously.
Yep.
What kinds of questions did you set out to answer with your research?
Well, I wanted to know where these women came from, why they came to New York, how it is that they found themselves in this stream of work, and how they felt while doing their work in these neighborhoods that weren't considered their own, since they didn't live in these neighborhoods.
Now, did you start out with any assumptions about them?
I don't know if I had any assumptions. I definitely knew they didn't live in the neighborhood because I lived in the neighborhoods that I was studying.
And your neighborhood was?
It was Carroll Gardens at that point.
Okay.
But I also researched other areas that were gentrified, such as Park Slope, Cobble Hill, and Brooklyn Heights.
Now, the nannies that you met in your neighborhood parks in Brooklyn were overwhelmingly West Indian women. Is that because West Indian women form the majority of the nanny population in New York City? I mean, you know, from my observation, the nannies I see on the Upper West Side seem to be West Indian as well. But is that true?
I don't know that they're necessarily the majority, although it appears that they might be the majority. There are a lot of Asian American or Asian first generation, South Asian, that is, and East Asian nannies as well as Tibetan nannies, as well as Latina nannies. So there are a variety of ethnic groups that do this form of work, but I would say majority are African American, Caribbean, as well as Asian American.
Why in the parks? Why are they in the parks?
Well, they're in the parks mainly in these gentrified neighborhoods because they're dense residences that allow for community building. And so often what you find is these nannies will go out onto the streets, find local parks where they can congregate and be with the children that they care for throughout the day, but be also among each other.
But it's also a matter of, as you pointed out in the book, that their employers want them out of the house.
Yeah, that's part of it as well. That is definitely part of it as well. A lot of the parents come from what we call in sociology the creative class. So a lot of them are freelancers or artists, working part-time for a few hours or maybe working 3 weeks in a row and then off for several months. So they tend to be in the home. They're working from home and typically want their nannies to be outside of the home while they're doing their work.
And it was rather surprising, I think, for you to learn how many of the caregivers have to spend so much time outside, you know, even during the winter months.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of it is mandated by the employers. They definitely need their space inside the home. A lot of them are stay-at-home mothers who also need the additional help. And so they want to be able to be at home by themselves to do something either work-related or housework, but they want the nanny to take the children out of the house so that they can conduct that work inside the home. So some of it is mandated by the employers, but some of it is the nanny wanting to go outside in these public spaces because then they start to see the friends that they have made over the years.
So how did you conduct your research? I mean, did you do formal interviews or is this from informal conversations? Did you always have your notebook and a tape recorder when you went out with your own kids to the park? How did that go?
I definitely had a recorder on me all of the time. The women that I followed, there were 25 that I followed very regularly over 3 years. And those women knew that I had a recorder on me at all times. I would capture some conversations that would happen outside of the women I was interviewing. Those weren't transcribed necessarily as part of the story, but helped to inform and maybe some of the more main stories that were being told in the parks and so on. But I recorded mainly, and I would also return home after my time at the parks and write down my notes on my computer.
Now, you talked about the parks as a place where these caregivers are able to create a sense of their own community. Talk about that.
About the community building?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, these nannies, whether they're being forced out of the home by the employer or told to go outside of the home by their employer, in these public spaces, especially in gentrified Brooklyn where there are a lot of little parks, little community parks set up or community gardens set up, allows for this micro interaction between nannies where they are able to have these conversations with each other. What it tends to happen is they find out which island the other nanny is from. They start to discuss the differences between those islands. And then you start to see little formations starting. So whether it's talking about food, whether it's talking about the political economy back home, the job that they're in currently in New York, you start to see that they form these alignments with one another based on similarities or differences. And so what I found is that they would tend to create community by forging relationships centered around food, around the informal savings economy that they call susus, and through a variety of other means, such as communication through technology. So they would often use cell phones to track each other to see, hey, where are you? Do you want to meet up at the park? What do you want to do today?
And this keeps them from being so isolated. Because I gather it's a job where they could feel rather isolated.
Absolutely, and most of the literature on domestic workers talks about this isolation inherent in the employer's home. This idea that you're very much separated from what is going on the streets. I think what gentrified Brooklyn allows for these nannies is this ability to create community in a very real way because it's so densely concentrated by commercial streets and shops, as well as residential homes, as well as these little parks spread out throughout. They're able to move in this fluid way where they can create community and then bring this community to various places within the neighborhood because everything's so densely concentrated.
Now, part of the dynamic that you write about between the nannies and their caregivers is a kind of, I'm going to call it a dance for control. The employers want to know where the caregivers are, what they're doing, how they're behaving, and the nannies want to maintain some freedom from that. And you mentioned that an important element in that power relationship is a cell phone.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Absolutely. The cell phone is used for two purposes. One, to check in. Two, for surveillance. And I would say a third reason is for community building. So the nannies use the cell phones with each other in order to find out where each other is throughout the day so that they can meet up at some point throughout the day. But it's also a means for them to connect to their families back home, either in the homeland, one of the islands that they come from, or to family that live actually in New York. So a lot of them have children or they have aunts and uncles that they would like to check in with throughout the day. The other use of technology is this idea of surveillance, where the employers want to find out what's going on with the children throughout the day. And as some of the nannies suggest, they do this in order to find out whether or not they should come home on time. And so it's used in this surveillance kind of way to see, what is my child doing, how are they behaving, and will this determine whether or not I come home on time? This is at the suggestion of the nannies, that this is the reason why they do so. But it is a concrete way for nannies and employers to have communication about the child throughout the day.
Right.
That's a very real thing.
Right.
As having children of my own, I do like to check in every now and then and find out how was their day at school.
Right. And I guess if the nannies are feeling hassled, they can just not answer the phone.
Yeah, and they do that. They do that. They have figured out the caller identification feature on the cell phones, and they definitely do not answer it if they don't feel like talking to the employer.
What were the major complaints that you heard from the nannies about their employers and about their work situations?
I would say the biggest number one problem that they have with their employer is pay. Either not getting paid on a timely basis, meaning at the same time every single week. So pay is a big problem. The extra duties that are required of them.
Can you stay late? Can you stay an extra hour? I'm
stay-
going to be home late.
I haven't caught the subway yet. I'm going
Right.
to be an hour late. They want some regularity in their workday, and that's really what they're searching for, whether it is pay, whether it is when the parent is coming home. The other issue is this idea of technology, not feeling like they're being surveilled at every point throughout the day. They would like to feel that they have some autonomy throughout the day with the children that they care for.
What do they get paid? Are we talking about people who are getting minimum wage, or is it less, or is it more? What is it? I forgot what minimum wage is. What is minimum wage now?
It varies. I mean, it's about $7 or so. But these women are getting paid decent salaries, some of them. So some will be getting paid $500 a week. Some of them would get paid $700 a week. It really depended on who the employer was. Some would only get paid $200 a week.
Really?
And now we know in New York City that doesn't go very far.
So some of them are getting paid less than the minimum wage, you think?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. The women I, in particular, interviewed tended to get paid more than minimum wage, but it still isn't considered New York living wage.
Right, right. One of the elements in this, I talk about the power dance between the caregivers and their employers, was that the caregivers felt a sense of superiority, that they were better cooks, better mothers, better disciplinarians. Tell me about that.
I think this is one of the ways that nannies combat this potential isolation that they would feel in the employer's home, or this very real isolation that they feel in the employer's home. There's a social hierarchy that happens within the household, and it stems from patriarchy systems where the father used to dominate the wife, and the wife was in control of everything that happened with the children, and they were placed in this position of control, which is really just saying, this is your job, this is your responsibility. And what we've seen is this transition where mothers now are placed in the position of the father, where they are telling the nanny, you know, here are your responsibilities, here's what you need to do. Because of the subordination of the nanny's position, what I'm finding is that in these communities that they're building, they're able to combat some of that isolation. They're able to combat some of the subordination by making these public statements about their mothering, making these public statements about disciplining, so that when a child is out of control at one of the parks or something, the nanny would say, you see that, that's the parents doing. That has nothing to do with me.
Right.
This has to do with the parent. And so you start to see these public displays of their perfection as mothers.
Right.
And because of this, I feel that what they're saying is, you know, while I know I'm in this exploited, subordinated position and I have very little control over the matter, there are these other things I do wonderfully that my employer does not have the ability to do.
Very interesting. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more with Tamara Mose Brown, author of Raising Brooklyn, Nannies, Child Care, and Caribbeans Creating Community, after the following message.
I'm lucky. Let me help you with that. I get to do something I love. It has nothing to do with touchdowns or titles.
Everybody bring it in.
I get to play a part in the life of someone just starting out.
How many of you think homework is just as important as teamwork?
I help keep kids in school,
Good.
and that's the name of the game. My name is LaDainian Thomason. I don't just wear the shirt, I live it.
Give, advocate, volunteer. Live United.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Tamara Mose Brown, author of Raising Brooklyn, Nannies, Child Care, and Caribbeans Creating Community. It's just been published by New York University Press. What percentage of these caregivers do you think are undocumented as opposed to legal? Do you have any sense of that?
We don't have any sense of that. That wasn't part of the questioning that I did with these particular women. However, they would disclose to me through our conversations what their status was. I don't have a sense of the actual percentage. What I can tell you is that according to the census, around 10,000 women who are first-generation Caribbean do say that they are child care workers on the census. What we do know is that there are about 200,000 domestic workers in New York City, of which a large portion of that would be Caribbeans and African Americans. So I can't really put a percentage on it, but I can tell you that I think it's a significant number.
Yeah. What education level are we talking about?
For the women who are coming up?
Mm-hmm.
It really varies. I would say definitely they go through their A levels. Okay, so let me backtrack. That would be our high school.
Right.
So they go through our high school system, not ours, but the Caribbean version of high school. And then they would have maybe some college or some technical school.
Okay.
But a lot of them owned little grocery stores back in the homeland, nothing like what we have here, but little corner stores. Some of them worked as teachers, some of them worked as accountants or secretaries back in the homeland.
So they're pretty well educated. They're pretty well educated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they are.
Yeah. You talked about some of the bonding that took place over food, how they would share different foods and have sometimes communal dinners with themselves and the kids that they took care of. Tell me about the susus. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah, susus. So susu is an informal economy that Caribbeans bring with them, and many immigrant groups have this. Koreans have it, certain groups from Mexico have it by different names. But the susu is really a way for women to save their money in a pool. So what happens is, say if you have 10 women, and every week each of them puts in $100 into what they call a pot. What they do is they take turns each week. So you contribute every week that $100, all 10 of you. And each week you rotate around and one person gets the entire pot. And so you walk away with these thousands of dollars, and then you can apply that to whatever you'd like to apply it to, whether it is your child's education, to vacations that you might want to take, to maybe opening up a small little catering business or something of that nature. Some of them use it to apply it to green card.
Why that as opposed to a bank account?
It's a good question, and I often ask them the same thing. Because it's built around this idea that you need to trust these women, I think it encourages them to, one, tap into their cultural roots, because this is something they're taking from the Caribbean. It allows them to feel connected still to their Caribbeanness or their West Indianness.
Right.
And so they have that. They have the trust factor. They know that if somebody doesn't pay, they're going to get it, meaning they're going to be chastised for a long time. They might be excluded from the susu in the future. It's a way of forcing women to save their money. But you're right. They're not gaining any interest by doing this, but it is a way for them to collectively pool their money and ensure that at least at some point they're going to have thousands of dollars at one particular time.
Do you get the sense that the nannies socialize with one another when they're off the job?
Absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely. What was funny is that it happened intergenerationally, which I found interesting. So one of the women that I spoke about in this book, named Molly, who is in her 60s and had raised 7 children of her own, she would often have parties around the Caribbean Day Parade here in New York. And she would have parties at her home, she would have parties at restaurants and so on, and invite all the other women, or ladies as they call each other. And they would participate on the weekends with her for these particular events. They celebrated birthdays together on the weekends. Some of the younger women would go to clubs with each other on the weekends. And they would also travel with each other. So a group of women would also travel every year to Atlanta for the Caribbean Day Parade that happens down there.
Now, this is one thing I've wondered about, sort of encountering the caregivers in my neighborhood. Do you think the nannies ever get the sense, have the feeling that people look down on them because of what they do?
Absolutely, absolutely. It came out time and time again in my field work with them. It was mainly an ethnographic piece of work, meaning that I literally hung out in these public spaces. And often some of the remarks I would get were race-based, meaning that they recognize that people recognize them as something different in these public spaces. And so they would be very cautious about how they moved across these spaces. They would be cautious about what they said in these spaces. And if any one woman was out of line speaking too loudly, which happened in the book in one of the cases, they would be reprimanded for that. They would be told, don't speak so loudly in that kind of aggressive tone because it reflects badly on us. And as one woman said, I believe it was Molly again, who said, all these white people are looking at us like black people can't get it together. you know, and so they definitely recognize that people are looking at them differently.
There have been efforts to unionize or at least to organize the caregivers. How successful has Domestic Workers United been in doing that?
They've been really integral in trying to organize domestic workers, and they've been so successful that they've actually passed a law now in New York State requiring that domestic workers receive certain minimum rights, meaning they should have 1 day's rest on the weekend, that if they choose to work on that day's rest, they get paid time and a half for that, that they are insured termination time, so 2 weeks notice of termination, or at least compensation for those 2 weeks. So what they have been able to do is pass a law that ensures these minimum rights to the women who are doing this kind of work.
Do you think that this bill is going to have a significant effect on the lives of nannies?
It will if it's being enforced properly, and we have yet to see what is going to happen with that. We don't know how lawmakers are going to receive this law in terms of making sure that they follow up with these employers.
Right.
I mean, I think what New York allows us to do because of the population, the size of the population, is to skirt these issues.
Yeah, yeah.
Because a lot of the women are undocumented, a lot of people don't want to have a formal contract between them and their employer. On the employer's end as well, they don't necessarily want a formal contract because then they're held accountable.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the ensuing years to find out whether or not these laws are actually being abided by.
Now, in general, the nannies don't get sick days or paid sick days or vacation days, right?
Right. This is now part of the new bill, so that women are allowed to have certain sick days and so on, paid or unpaid.
Did you see any of the nannies make the transition out of domestic work? I mean, I know go back to school or find a higher paying job. Did you see that happen for any of the women that you got to know?
No. What I have seen, though, is the education bit. So a lot of the women are doing their GEDs currently or training for their GEDs. A lot of them are in college, especially in the CUNY system that allows them to participate even if they are undocumented. So they are gaining education. Have I seen them transition out of that work? No, not yet, because they're still working to pay off their bills. I have seen one particular woman start her own side business in catering.
Okay.
So she'll do little family events, and she will do little birthday parties for friends or friends of friends, and she'll do that on the weekends. So she's able to make extra money doing that. But I've never seen anybody completely transition out of domestic work. I know that's not the case for all of the women, but the particular women that I interviewed.
Did your research change your perceptions of nannies?
Yeah, it did. I didn't really know anything about nannying at all. It made me respect the work that they do. It did make me realize how subordinated they really are in the household economy, and it made me realize that they really do miss their homeland and everything that they had around them, including family and friends and their culture and their foods. But what I also noticed is that they were able to replicate some of that here in New York because we have these West Indian enclaves in both Brooklyn and Queens strongly, and some in the Bronx as well. So I've noticed that what they are able to do is manage their lives in a very real way, despite the fact that they're in these positions. And I found that admirable, that they were able to find these ways of combating.
And a lot of these women, they have children of their own, so they got 2 shifts, basically.
Absolutely.
They got a whole other one when they get home.
Yeah, as do their employers.
And maybe a husband to cook dinner for.
Exactly.
In your book, you list certain obligations that you feel employers have towards their nannies: to help them become documented, to perhaps to offer MetroCards to those who have commuting expenses, to acknowledge their work, to show appreciation, to acknowledge their birthdays, perhaps with a day off or a card, to give them time off to care for a sick child, to refrain from requesting additional duties for which they are not paid. Just all elements of respect.
All elements of respect, all elements that I think their employers are probably receiving, maybe not receiving all of those benefits, but I think if you know you're paying your childcare provider less than minimum wage, if you can offer them a Metro card
Right.
so they can get to and from work, that would be lovely.
Right.
An extra $20 a week isn't going to hurt anybody.
Yeah.
I think what the problem is that at the outset of these particular employments, these types of markers aren't set out. And I think this is what Domestic Workers is trying to do. They are trying to say that you should have this contract that outlines, here's what you will get
Right.
paid, here are some of the extras I'm going to give you. That way you have somebody holding something accountable for something.
Right. Right.
But other than that, yeah, I mean, little perks like maybe remembering their birthdays would be lovely. I'm surprised at how many employers actually don't know their domestic workers' birthdays, or, you know, recognize that they do have children of their own and inquire about those children. How are they doing in school? You know, is there anything I can help with?
Right.
You would just think that as humans, we would relate to one another like this. Now, the flip side to that is other people say, well, no, this is an employer-employee relationship. They shouldn't even get into this. But it's a different dynamic. They're working in your home.
Right.
They're working with your children. It's a different interaction.
Yeah.
You would think that there would be more of a human interaction.
I found the book very interesting, you know, and a glimpse into the lives of people we see around us daily, but perhaps didn't know much about.
Yeah. That's
I want to thank Tamara Mose Brown, author of Raising Brooklyn, Nannies, Childcare, and Caribbeans, Creating Community. It's just been published by the New York University Press. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.